Hello everyone and welcome to our Chapter 2, Part 1 lecture on Ancient Greek dress. Thank you for listening, and if you pay attention in the background you can hear some ancient Greek music. Playing this because I used to play when we had face-to-face interaction before class, and during break I would play music from that era, that time frame. Some background music, so yes, if you hear that, that's Greek music. So we're going to look at Greek clothing, really look at some of the main terms that you need to know. A little background during times, and there's so much, this is just scrape of the surface. So much happened during ancient Greek time. It thrived for over 4,000 years, and its influence is still seen today. It impacted us in all disciplines. We're talking, they invented trial by jury. They developed the Greek myths. So a lot of myths that a lot of companies have based their image on, and multiple stories, movies, books have been based on. Democracy, the concept of democracy came from the Greeks. Comedy and tragedy came from the Greeks. They developed the theater and the Olympics. So this all came from the Greeks, and much more, by the way. This is just kind of the main highlights. Just so influential. It's the main classical age for the Greeks was between 500 and 323 BC or BCE. If you start doing research, some of the things say BCE. I'm not expecting you to memorize the years. I just want you to kind of know the timeline. Now, Greece did have a golden age, the most creative eras in history of Western civilization. They developed their philosophy. So the classic Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And they really came up with these theories and contemplated and really have forever influenced thought. But they really were thinking about life and the meaning of life. So when you look at books, I can't tell you how many times they'll quote Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle. So very influential. Dramas, classic dramas written by Sophocles and Euripides that dealt with human nature and the idea of good and bad, good versus evil. But basically, the nature of the human spirit, and when you're dealt with temptation and when you're dealt with problems, how do you resolve them? One thing they loved is the human body. So Greek sculpture, they loved sculpture. Paintings and sculptures are amazing. And they really did glorify the human body. So you're going to see a lot of nude statues. They're really big on that because they're not ashamed. They don't see it as anything dirty. It's just they glorified the human body. Now, in terms of clothing, it's actually pretty simple. They did not cut and sew their fabric pieces. They literally would take rectangular pieces of cloth in different sizes and they draped it on the body. So basically, no cutting, no sewing. They would just wrap it around the body and they either tie it or they would pin it. Three main garments are the chiton, the chlamys, and the himation. So we're going to talk about those. And they just had a lot of variations and a lot of adjustments. From 7th to 1st century BC, both men and women wore the chiton. And typically it was knee length for men, although some did wear it long, but typically knee length and ankle length for women. So women would wear it longer than men, and they would be kept in place. You're like, how does that stay on the body? Basically with pins, brooches, tying with cord or a belt around the waist. That's how tying it and adjusting it on the body. So when you see all this beautiful drape, they're all just rectangular pieces of cloth, pinned, tied, and wrapped around the body. That's it. No sewing and no cutting of the cloth. It's basically just draping and tying and pinning. Now there's two types of chiton. You need to know this. Will be on the quiz. Doric chiton is generally made out of wool. So this one is a little bit thicker, a little bit heavier. Not a wool like a wool blazer. Don't think of like that super thick, stiff fabric. However, it's not as drapable. So the Doric chiton is a little bit more plain, has a simple, it doesn't quite drape as pretty on the body. The Ionic chiton is generally made out of linen. So it's more flexible, so it allowed for more pleating and variety of folds. It just draped a little bit nicer. So when you look at pictures and you look at some that are a little bit more plain and stiff, and those that have lots of gathers and seem to drape better, the one that drapes better is the Ionic chiton, and the Doric chiton is a little stiffer because it's made out of wool. Now, most people think that they were all made out of white, but they're actually proven wrong. If you just look at the statues lose color over time. You have to think about that. But they've researched and they showed that there was patterns and some color used, except for the very poor. The poor had just plain white, but they did have some borders, some embroideries. This is the Doric chiton and this is the Ionic chiton. So lower class members didn't like the fact that they couldn't really use color, so they did dye their garments like this reddish brown, but it wasn't actually approved by authorities. It was frowned upon, but that was their way of rebelling. So that's basically the only color you could see for lower class is this reddish brown, but typically they wore white or off-white. Upper classes showed more color, and they did use some red, yellow, and purple. So sometimes when you see some of this color, that's actually accurate. Now, the second garment is the chlamys. Basically, it's kind of like a cloak, a short cloak, and you would wear it over the chiton, and you would fasten it typically over one shoulder with a brooch or a pin. That's a chlamys. So you have the chiton underneath and the chlamys over it. So the chlamys was a short cloak. So young men, horsemen would wear it. And you see, pay attention to the plots and the clay matter that you see, because they would paint a lot on that. So do pay attention. This is from the Met. Now, the chlamys also, if you see some pictures and you're like, what? Where's the chiton? They would wear the chlamys with nothing underneath because, again, they're not ashamed of the human body. Like in gymnasiums, both sexes were naked when they did their exercise. So the Olympics were done in the nude. So that's what it is. So in certain pictures when you're like, I don't see anything underneath, that's actually accurate. So they would wear the chlamys with nothing or the chiton underneath. Now, the female, if you notice, I said young men and horsemen. Well, what about the women? They would wear a peplos. That's their version of the chlamys. So it's called the peplos. And what it is it's not just like a cloak. They would put it on top. See, they would fold over, and it would be on top of the chiton, or would replace the chiton completely. And what happened was, eventually when trade expanded, they were made out of like silk, and it would drape beautifully. So that's how you get these beautiful drapings. And then when you tie it, this is where you get these beautiful, because it's made out of silk. Himation is a larger cloak, also used typically in colder weather. So you look at this and you're like, oh, it's colder weather. He's bare-chested, but that's used for colder weather. Typically could be about 6 to 8 feet wide. Some were bigger and some were smaller, but that's typical. So a lot of fabric, they just kind of gathered it. Women, there's statues where females wore the himation as well. So see that? Other garments like the perizoma, it's a loincloth used by men. It's used as underwear or for athletic contests. Not every exercise was done in the nude. They would wear the loincloth. And other garments, dye plaques. So this is a small rectangle piece of fabric worn over the ionic chiton, and it kind of draped like a himation. So kind of almost like think of it like a stole in a certain way. And it typically did clasp on one shoulder, just like the chlamys does for men. Or they rolled it up like they rolled the himation, and they can cover their heads with it. You can see a lot of draping. The chlamydon was more complicated. It kind of pleated the fabric into a band, and then you can use it in many different ways. Now hair, both men and women wore long hair originally, and then only for boys and women, and then men would cut their hair. At puberty, basically kind of a rites of passage, a boy would cut his hair off and offer his hair to the gods. Then women started to wear hair kind of in a chignon, kind of like a bun, a loose bun, and worn low on the nape of the neck. And later they started, and this is the typical kind of Greek look that you are used to. They would weave ribbons. They would put jewels on their hair. Sometimes they would form like a cone to put in their hair. They also wore tiaras. After the Roman conquest, they really started elaborating the curling, the frizzing. So they liked wavy hair. So this is the typical Greek look. But if you take a look to the left, you can see different hairstyles. You can see different headpieces that became very popular. Now, facial hair, most men wore beards. The younger men would shave it off. So when you see statues, if he's clean shaven, it's a young man. And if you see a beard, that's supposed to be an older man. And the way you could see that is younger gods like Apollo or Mercury were clean-shaven. Older gods like Jupiter and Vulcan were depicted as bearded. Jewelry, makeup, mostly worn by women, but some men did wear makeup and jewelry, but it's mostly women are the ones that wore most of the jewelry and makeup. Necklaces, earrings, rings, decorative pins, especially for fastening the chiton. And they did use perfumes and makeup, as you can see in the writings. It's not really depicted much on the statues. They get it most from the writing and the samples that they found, but some of these, I mean, it's pretty amazing. You can see use of gold, rock crystal, emeralds. It's beautiful. Definitely worth looking at. Footwear, basically indoors, they were barefooted. They did wear, in the streets, the poor would be barefoot, and the wealthy did wear some sandals. Also fitted shoes, ankle or mid-calf. So they would wear some, so there are some covered shoes, but most of the time sandals. And for travel or for war, they did wear, boots that were laced up, made out of leather. In terms of battle, leather tunics reinforced with metal plaques and greaves on their legs. So what you see on their legs, the armor covering their shins are called greaves. And Greek helmets would enclose their entire head to protect them. And light infantry also wore the chlamys. And the hoplites is a type of soldier, and you can see the bronze breastplate, so you could get an idea, 50 to 60 pounds. That's pretty heavy. And they had, oftentimes they would have the design on the crest of their helmet. They would have a Greek shield called a hoplon, short swords called xiphos, a secondary weapon, greaves again for shin protection, and long spears called doru. Another thing, last couple things you need to know in terms of print or pattern, they're known for the Greek key. So see this geometric border print, very popular. Now you would see it often in a headband. Those that would ride the chariots call it meander. You could see the Greek key on there. But you could see the Greek key if you notice when you look at certain samples with the border, you would see this pattern. That's called the Greek key. And it's been modified, so you can see in this picture lots of different ways that other prints have been based off that. And they've used this for printing, for weaving, for painting, for tiles, woodwork, you name it. The Greek key has been used for so much, and it's been used for inspiration. So the one on the top here, that bottom picture, is a Greek key, and you can see how it's evolved. Lastly, children. Children were typically naked. Babies wore a cloth diaper. And young children were pretty much in the nude unless it was cold, and they would have a rectangular piece of cloth wrapped around them. No specialized clothing. Basically, when they reached about 7 years of age, they dress as adults, basically. So no special clothing for children. And these are modern influences. You can see Chanel. All the main designers will use Dolce & Gabbana. They've been all influenced by Greek clothing. That concludes our lecture. Thank you so much for listening.